Good morning, my name is Priscilla Rebecca Elvis, and the topic that I'm going to present is the impacts of Suggestopedia in learning English vocabulary. Vocabulary is important in building the understanding and the use of language, and insufficient knowledge of vocabulary may lead to difficulties in learning the target language. Vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension are strongly correlated. The level of students' understanding of the text they read in high school can be predicted from their word knowledge in primary school. Yet, Malaysian students have difficulty learning English vocabulary regardless of English being the second language in Malaysia instead of as a foreign language compared to most countries. Wilkins 1972 stated that without grammar, someone can hardly convey the message's meaning. However, without vocabulary, people may find it hard to bring their meaning across. And according to Haynes and Baker in 1993, instead of the lack of reading comprehension practice, the significant disadvantage for second language learners is the scant comprehension of English vocabulary. The idea that listening to background music boosts learning has a long tradition and has especially been proposed by Georgi Lozanov, Bulgarian psychotherapist who developed a teaching method, Suggestopedia, in which background music, mostly classical music, during learning plays a pivotal role. Thus, this study investigates whether there is a significant difference in using Suggestopedia to enhance vocabulary memorization as compared to a traditional setting without music. Despite English being the second language in Malaysia, one of the challenges Malaysian students faced is the inability to memorize the target vocabulary. Copious ways were introduced to teach vocabulary. Still, students could not acquire vocabulary successfully. According to Briat Mojo 2021, Suggestopedia is advantageous in the teaching of vocabulary to young learners. Therefore, this study investigates the impacts of Suggestopedia in teaching English vocabulary. The purpose of this study is to determine if teaching using Suggestopedia would produce a measurable difference in the English vocabulary achievement of Year 3 students in SK Kulai Johor. And the second one is to determine the significant difference in students' achievement between teaching vocabulary in a classroom with and without Suggestopedia. This study was carried out to answer the following research questions. Number 1, does teaching English vocabulary using Suggestopedia have a measurable difference in the English vocabulary achievement of Year 3 students in SK Kulai? Number 2, is there any significant difference between teaching with and without using Suggestopedia in English vocabulary learning? 1.5 Significance of study. The findings of this study would help create awareness among school administrators in using Suggestopedia as a vocabulary instruction based on its effects in learning English vocabulary. Lazanov 1978 suggested that Suggestopedia can accelerate teaching languages approximately 3 to 5 times as quickly as conventional method, which is without music. And Astutik 2019 stated that music is an essential device in promoting language abilities. And also Pujasari and Rahayu 2018 also believe that Suggestopedia is a suitable method for teaching reading, which may lead to vocabulary memorization. Research design for this study is an experimental research design. Experimental research design was used for this study to find the cause and effect relationships between variables. There were 2 variables for this study, which is Suggestopedia, independent variable, and vocabulary memorization, learners' language abilities, and performance levels are the dependent variables. Experimental research design was used to measure significant differences in terms of the effectiveness of Suggestopedia in learning vocabulary in the English language classroom. The teaching method that was used in this study is Suggestopedia. Therefore, selective sampling for the respondents was necessary. All respondents were of the same proficiency level. This research was conducted on primary 3 school students with intermediate proficiency in English in SK Kulai Johor. The research sample comprised of 20 students, which was divided into two groups. The first group consisted of 10 students under the control group, whereas the remaining 10 students were in the experimental group. Figure 1. Pretest conceptual framework of research methodology for control and experimental groups. The students were briefed accordingly about the task. The teacher distributed the texts to each student, and the text entitled Goldilocks and Three Bears. Next, the teacher read the text while acting out the story. The teacher read the text while with average speed. The students then read after the teacher. After that, the teacher and students read the text together while acting out the story. One English teacher was assigned to teach both groups in different environment and time. At the end of the lesson, the students were assessed using the information gap test. After the reading session, the students were given 5 questions on the new vocabulary based on the narrative text in Year 3 textbook. Figure 3, post-test conceptual framework of research methodology for experimental group. Basically, the students were briefed accordingly about the new method that was Suggestopedia. And the teacher also encouraged the students to relax while the music played in the background. So other steps, they are all the same as figure 1 and figure 2. The researchers analyzed the data by using SPSS. Mean and frequency were determined, while percentage and frequency obtained were used to summarize the study's findings. The findings were used to determine to what extent Suggestopedia affects teaching vocabulary among primary 3 students in SK Kulai Johor, and to determine any significant difference between using Suggestopedia music or without Suggestopedia or without music in learning vocabulary. Pretest, Table 3, pretest mean and standard deviation results for control and experimental groups. In the table, not one respondent was missing in the study. 20 respondents participated in the experiment. There were 10 students in the control group and another 10 in the experimental group. The mean score for the pretest of the control group is 2, and that of the experimental group is 2.30. The standard deviation for the control and experimental groups is 1.886 and 1.889 respectively. Based on table 3, the pretest results showed little difference between control and experimental groups. From the results, the researchers can say that students' performances in both groups are the same without using Suggestopedia for the experimental and control groups. Based on figures 4 and 5, pretest results for control and experimental groups do not show a vast difference between the two groups. The results offered very little difference, and it can be concluded that students have the same level of proficiency during the pretest, and their score in the pretest does not show different proficiency. Based on the results, the researchers can conclude that students may have developed anxiety during the pretest, and the affective filters may have increased. Table 4, post-test mean and standard deviation results for control and experimental groups. The table shows the post-test mean score and standard deviation for both groups. There is a significant difference in the result. The standard deviation for the control group is 1.578, and that of the experimental group is 2.237 with 0.695 difference for both groups. Both standard deviations indicate a smaller number compared to the difference between the two means. Figure 6, histogram of post-test mean and standard deviation for control group. The figure shows the histogram of the post-test for the mean and standard deviation of the control group. It shows a decrease in standard deviation during the pre and post test. The pre-test indicates a standard deviation of 1.886, while the post-test indicates a standard deviation of 1.578. Based on table 4, the post-test result shows a lower mean and standard deviation than the result in the pre-test. Therefore, it can be concluded that students were not aware of what they were doing, and that their brains were not in a relaxed state of mind. And this is also according to Priyat Mojo 2020. The data collected showed that students who studied using Suggestopedia or music in the background scored higher than students who studied without using Suggestopedia. Based on the results, we could conclude that students who studied with musical backgrounds could perform better and memorize well. It is proven that music creates an enjoyable environment and motivates students to learn a second language effectively. Though Suggestopedia is less popular in Malaysia and not implemented fully, its importance cannot be ignored. More research should be carried out to determine its effects on different elements of language learning, such as grammar. The limitation of this study is the number of updated journals related to the field of Suggestopedia in language learning, particularly on vocabulary memorization, are limited, and researchers had to rely on outdated journals available for this study. This shows that Suggestopedia is an under-researched field, and therefore there is a need to conduct further studies on this method of teaching. That's all from me. Thank you for listening.